I'm Scott Schiff with William Swig. Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. William, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Good, good. Got some good feedback from the first show. Today we'll be talking mostly about cancel culture, and we'll play some clips from people in the Ayn Rand world talking about it. We'll talk about what it means and even some of what can be done about it.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Good, good. So, I mean, most broadly, I would call cancel culture the moral code of the political left used to silence opposition. And I know that there have always been power relationships where one faction tries to get rid of another faction politically or tries to get people fired. But cancel culture is intertwined with a history of the left and how they ultimately quell all dissent as being illegitimate as their means of achieving a one party state.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's essentially at the root of it. Cancel culture is a tactic of power taking, and it's rooted in the collectivist ideology. So basically, it's just their way, their method of acquiring power.
Absolutely. And I think you can't separate the idea that the postmodernist left is like a religion. They apply Marx's historical inevitability of socialism as their own version of determinism. They use that inevitable sense of victory to demoralize their opponents. Their heaven is a post-revolution, post-capitalist future where the oppressors are destroyed and no one is here stopping equal outcomes.
Yeah, I see this as history repeating itself because man repeats himself. It's
Right.
quite logical. I mean, man does the same things over and over and over again, and so you would naturally get history repeating itself. And now that we live in a world where God is dead, we are seeing the formation of a new religion, a more secular, democratic religion. Basically, we're seeing this history repeat itself of a religious formation. And beyond that, what leftists are doing is they're misintegrating a lot of different things. They're creating a new dogma around these misintegrations, such as race and culture equaling ethnicity. Ayn Rand identified ethnicity as an anti-concept. And
Okay.
so what they do is they create these anti-concepts to destroy all the other concepts that you need in order to understand reality. Um, Leftism
Absolutely.
is basically at the root of leftism. I see it as an attempt to destroy all these concepts, including the concept of class. Marxism was all about anti-class and they want to get rid of classes and everyone's equal. Well, the modern version of that is just destroy the word class, destroy the concept. And so they're trying to destroy everything that the concept class is based on, such as like race, sex, culture, identity, those types of things.
Yeah, I think that's definitely happening. I think what they've done is they've changed from class warfare, the haves and have nots, to an identity politics warfare, changing, now it's identity enemies. They're oppressor races or genders or sexual orientations. People genuinely feel bad about the history of race in this country, which is why their altruist roots kind of pushed the change to that area because people weren't feeling as bad about being rich. Maybe that was Rand's view. I liken it almost to like in Ghostbusters at the end when the evil god is saying, choose the form of your destructor. People are like, I don't want to do that. I try to be a good guy. I'm not even racist. They're like, there, we will call you a racist.
Yeah, yeah. Getting back to identity, it really is about transitioning to this identity culture. And I think the reason why they do that is because it's an attempt to destroy concepts that are at the root of identity. such as a group or a member of a group. Like usually you think of yourself, I'm a human, I'm a rational animal, that's my group. And then as an individual, I'm me, I'm William, I do this and that, I have certain personality, certain traits. Well, the left is trying to destroy all of that and just have identity, which is uh, an anti-concept. They're using it as an anti-concept to eliminate the concepts of like group and a member of a group or an individual of a group. Uh, and identity is their dogma. It's like you can change it at will. If you're a man, you don't have to be a man. You can be a woman. That's your new identity, can be a woman. So their version of identity is subjective. It's not objective. It's just totally within your realm of manipulation.
Right. It also starts with this view of multiple realities that you can't possibly understand the, blank reality because theirs is different, whether it's a female or a, transgender. You can't possibly understand the things that they've gone through. And it's a way of not only, creating separate realities like a religion, but also just saying, you can't understand your fellow human.
Yeah, well, you can't understand it because reality is what you make it. So it's like you're not, someone else is part of objective reality. They're not you. So in order to understand that other person, you've got to look out at reality. You've got to seriously consider what that person is and what he's doing and
That's right.
treat it as a scientific investigation. But they can't do that. They can't know what the other person is because that would require being an objectivist, looking out at reality, understanding what that person is and what he's doing. They are subjectivists. They need to just think of their ideas about what that person is, and then that's what that person is, because it's what's their idea of him is.
Right. And that's where, you can see that in fact these anti-racism people are in fact have more of the characteristics of what we traditionally call racist, but it's done in the name of anti-racism as their way of avoiding those realities or that reality. Cancel culture is a historical tactic of the left. I mean, it's ultimately how they hound their enemies into fear of standing up against it. We saw it in Russia even before Rand was born, the Narodniks and socialist revolutionaries telling people that anyone with a bourgeois attitude would be silenced after the revolution, Marx promised. We saw it in China in Mao's Cultural Revolution of the 60s, where kids were encouraged to beat class enemies and encourage them to kill themselves. They claim it's a quest for racial identity justice today, but there's a double standard where they say, well, if you're an oppressed group like blanks, women, or blacks, can't be racist. Based on the idea that oppressed groups can't be bigoted because they don't hold traditional levels of power. I mean, it's even rationalizes itself in, Muslim homophobia is a result of Western colonialism as a kind of way that they can rationalize any alliance depending on what power they're trying to grab with whom. It's arbitrary. It's with people using these unimpeachable claims that they're for, ending historical injustices as their way to take power.
Yeah, yeah, I think there is a strong aspect of that. One thing I wanted to point out about the tactic of cancel culture is that I think it serves a dual purpose. It on one hand, it gives the collective a goal, like an emotion-based goal, while also scaring them into submission. So it helps the collective move in a particular direction, and that distracts them from thinking about other things. But also, cancel culture works to eliminate or remove any heretical thought within the group.
Sure.
It isolates them, it exiles them, and that maintains group cohesion by enforcing the disassociation involved with cancel culture.
Absolutely. In some ways, the moderate lefties are more afraid of cancel culture than we are because all their friends are lefties.
Yeah, yeah. They're still in the process of, purifying their collective. They're trying to get this pure form of leftism or woke culture. And in order to do that, the leadership needs to purge that group. Whoever's trying to like stay in that group, the leadership needs to purge that group of any bad elements or anyone who causes problems or questions their authority or threatens the dogma.
Right.
It's all about the leadership maintaining power and control over the mob or the collective.
Yes, in fact, it reminds me this Quillette piece that I read about postmodernism a few years ago, just talking about it being a power grab. This is a quote: postmodernists eschew any notion of objectivity, perceiving knowledge itself as a construct of power differentials rather than anything that could possibly be mutually or objectively agreed on. Science itself becomes an instrument of Western oppression. Indeed, all discourse is a power struggle between oppressors and oppressed. In this scheme, there is no Western civilization to preserve. As the more powerful force in the world, it automatically takes on the role of oppressor, and therefore any form of equity must consequently involve the overthrow of Western hegemony.
That's a great point. I mean, I think it's absolutely true. Just when you think of the word discourse, I mean, that means you have a conversation with somebody. And why do you have a conversation with somebody? To achieve some understanding of something. And so if the collective leadership wants to maintain control, they have to eliminate a lot of discourse, because what happens in discourse is people disagree and then they argue, and then you bring in evidence to prove your point, and it just leads to science. So they need to stop it in its tracks. They need to stop this process of Western reason and science and logic right at the root, because it'll just lead to science, and they can't have that.
Yeah, if you can't have contradictions, you may start getting new adherents questioning you. I mean, the truth is, the other piece of this about the arbitrary and changing nature of the correct terms to use. This is from my Facebook friend, Oleg Atbashian, who witnessed life from behind the Iron Curtain. This is his quote. He says, life would have been easier if the list of forbidden things existed in the form of a spreadsheet with 3 columns for the name, description, and magnitude, similar to the list of forbidden rock bands. But even if such a list of forbidden things existed, we would by definition be forbidden to see it. All we knew was that things on that list were always changing, and so we had to be careful what we say and to whom, which taught us never to trust our own judgment. Instead, we were expected to check the party newspapers for reliable updates on how to see the reality correctly on any day of the week. Once I entered the workforce, newspaper subscriptions became mandatory. And, so it's not even about consistent words. Whatever you're saying today, they're still going to call you bigot in 5 years for using it, even as you're trying to play catch up. And so many objectivists and even libertarians, they want to follow the rules. This cancel culture ends up using our own virtue against us, because it's like, all right, now don't use these words today. Okay, I can follow that rule, but then they're going to create some new arbitrary rules for you tomorrow just to make sure you're still following along with them.
Yeah, there's virtue in properly identifying reality and coming up with true facts of reality. And that virtue has to become a vice under a leftist dictatorship. Um, the use of arbitrary terms is critical to a movement based on dogma and faith, whether that dogma is written in a book or chanted on the streets, it's critical for them to maintain the control over the people. The mystical left, they have to habituate itself to disregard the evidence. This is critical because the evidence will prove them wrong. And if people start paying attention to the evidence, they might start developing this sort of affection or attraction to reality, to objective reality. And the left can't have that. For the same reason that Muslims cover up their women's bodies, the leftists cover up evidence in a burqa of arbitrary claims. It's basically, we can't have you looking at this thing because you, as an individual, will have the wrong response to it. And we don't want that to happen. So we need to prevent you from seeing the truth, the facts, the beautiful woman, the figure. Otherwise, your emotions, your ideas will get stirred up and you won't pay attention to what the mob leadership is saying.
That's a great point. There's an implicit view of humanity that they can't be trusted to make their own decisions. They're thought of as evil, and that's why they need to be controlled. When I think back to my early memories of cancel culture before it was a known concept, to me, it started as the left saying, well, we put free speech, we don't want to see hate speech within free speech, which sounds great until you start realizing it's an expanding definition that includes even being pro-capitalism. I don't like fascists either until you realize they mean us. I also saw memes from lefty friends saying that, if you shut people down, it may be because you're an a-hole, almost like the Rand argument, the it's not censorship argument. I would also see them posting something from Karl Popper on the paradox of intolerance, basically taking his quote that, we should claim in the name of tolerance the right not to tolerate the intolerant, which is actually a distortion of his original meaning. But he was saying it should only be in, extreme circumstances, but they've taken it to mean that, well, now if I just call you intolerant, I can do whatever I want to you. I just see the new left uses it to rationalize an anything goes mentality against their political opponents.
Yeah, well, for me, I guess I wasn't noticing cancel culture like in the beginning when it started, because probably because I'm not part of that culture. And as a new idea is starting up, you're really not going to be exposed to it unless you're like really paying attention to things that happen outside your sphere of influence. And
Right.
so I had to, start thinking about this a few years ago. I guess, when everyone started blowing it up on social media and trying to get people fired and all that, I started noticing it and thinking about it. And then just recently, I started actually looking into the history of it. And what I read was pretty interesting, and I think it would help to understand what cancel culture is and what it means. So I want to give a little bit of the history of the development.
Sure.
Back in 1983, this songwriter, Nile Rodgers, wrote a song called Your Love Is Canceled. And even though the song itself wasn't a hit, he was a pretty big star in the Black music culture.
Okay.
And the song is about a woman who basically abuses the relationship. Like, he's a star and she's not really a star, but she tries to act like she's a big thing because she's around him. And then he says, oh, you can't do that, I don't like you, messing with that aspect of stardom. And so he just says, you're canceled, your love is canceled. And this was, I think this was kind of a new metaphor that he was creating. He was comparing ending a relationship with ending like a TV show. Um, Nile Rodgers himself was obsessed with TV. He's known to have TVs playing in every room of his house 24 hours a day. It's kind of weird, but so he was very aware of like TV shows getting canceled and all that, and so that was in the forefront of his mind. Then the screenwriter for the movie New Jack City happened to be listening to this song when he wrote a line for Wesley Snipes in that movie. Wesley Snipes plays the drug boss or the drug kingpin of
Yeah,
Harlem
I
in that
remember.
movie. And there's a line where he's getting mad at a woman who's giving him lip for treating someone poorly. And he says, cancel that bitch. And so then that line from that movie started becoming widespread in Black culture, and it was used in rap songs by 50 Cent and Lil Wayne. And then from there, it just blew up on so-called Black Twitter. And I think from there, it jumped into the mainstream culture. So you can see how this is really more of a tactic. It started out as a tactic of treating people like TV shows or just some program, or not a non-human entity. It's basically treating people inhumanely and just ending them and then moving on.
Yeah, that's certainly how it's evolved. That's probably a good segue into some of these clips from people in the Ayn Rand world. I want to start. I heard Ben Baer actually say some good things about cancel culture last year. Here he ties it to the argument from intimidation and quotes Rand's definition.
The essential characteristic of the argument from intimidation, she writes, is its appeal to moral self-doubt and its reliance on the fear, guilt, or ignorance of the victim. It is used in the form of an ultimatum demanding that the victim renounce a given idea without discussion under threat of being considered morally unworthy. The pattern is always only those who are evil or dishonest or heartless or insensitive, ignorant, etc., can hold such an idea. And obviously you would need to add a new example to her list, because now today it's only those who are racist or only those who are transphobic or only those who are bigoted can hold a position like this.
So I think Ben Baer is correct in that this is an argument from intimidation. I think that the cancel culture is trying to intimidate people into agreeing or conforming by attacking their character. It's really a crude form of ad hominem. They're saying, you are bad because you have this idea and you're not conforming to our ideas. They're not pointing to any real evidence other than what you said. So it's basically relying on people to just agree with the leadership who's saying they're a bad person because they said this. And there's no context really. There's no argument. It's just you said this, therefore you're bad.
Yeah, I agree. The real purpose of the argument from intimidation to me is one, to silence people and also to dehumanize them. Ultimately you're trying to groom your opponents into self-censoring or to at least virtue signal to avoid being further called a monster, racist, bigot. And also when one uses the argument from intimidation often enough, saying you want dirty air, you want kids in cages, capitalism is racism, you start to believe it of them, and you really do think they should be hounded out of society or worse. And the sad truth is the argument from intimidation works on a lot of people. No one wants to be called heartless, bigoted, and it can easily turn into a sanction of trying to prove to them that you're not as bad as they think. You know, when the accusers are not even being objective in the first place, they're using it as a tactic just to get you to do exactly that. I mean, identity politics guilt to me is about using our own virtue against us, that because we aspire not only not to be bigots, but also not to be misunderstood as bigots, you know, always willing to offer explanations to those using it as a tactic to avoid understanding in the first place in pursuit of their ideological agenda. You know, that is what Ayn Rand was talking about at the sanction. I think we've got to stop playing defense and get on offense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the critical point there that Bear was making is that it's a rhetorical tactic, and that's one of the elements that defines cancel culture.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, ARI recently put out a video challenging cancel culture with Ankar Gate, and he had some comments where he's defining cancel culture himself. Let's take a listen.
Limited a little bit. I mean, you can rattle off example after example of cases now where it's some kind of social pressure, a lot of people speaking out, usually on social media, to get, as you put it, get someone fired, to get them deplatformed, so they're invited to speak at a university, and then that invitation is withdrawn. So that they face real consequences. That there's, and it's, I put it that there's the expression, at least how valid it is, how sincere it is, but there's an expression of moral outrage, like real moral criticism. Usually it's moral outrage at the action, and that the person should suffer some significant consequences as a result of that, the moral transgression that they've supposedly engaged in. I think, and it's, so it is, I mean, the reason it's being talked about so much is that I think it really is a widespread phenomenon.
I really appreciate him identifying it as widespread, something that's increasing, but his definition equating it with moral outrage, to me, it almost applied a type of affinity with the moral seriousness of the so-called anti-racist left because of how earnestly they're using these, protestations or slogans to take control of us. I happen to think his moral outrage definition widens the term too broadly. He ends up using an example of Bill Cosby as a victim of cancel culture too, depending on how widely you broaden it. Here's that clip.
And if you bring in examples like Bill Cosby, then it's like, is it a mob formed around that? If there was a lot of people saying, like, maybe we shouldn't deal with Bill Cosby anymore, maybe NBC should we even show the Bill Cosby show in syndication? Like, should we air this anymore or not?
One point about the mob, whether Dr. Gate asked if there was a mob formed around Bill Cosby, and I think it's important to note that we have a new form of mob. Ever since social media was invented, we now have social media mobs. It's kind of like transferring the street mob to online. There's no real physical force, but it's still intellectual force. Like a mob can go on the street and mass together and become a physical force or threat, but they're also chanting and shouting and saying things. And they're usually a well-built mob is projecting an intellectual slogan or propaganda or message. That part can still be done online. So you can have, a propagandistic mob online who's massing on Facebook or Twitter, urging people to fire you or cancel your account, that sort of thing. So in a sense, it's a type of mob that's online.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and my issue with what Ankar was saying was that, I mean, has anyone really been pointing to Bill Cosby as a victim of cancel culture besides maybe his legal team and publicist? I mean, in addition to Bill Cosby, he also uses examples of trying to primary moderate GOP members with pro-Trump candidates, or he also uses the example of people trying to get him fired from ARI. He's referring to the schism with Biddle and Barney. I mean, people will try to get you fired. That's different than cancel culture and doing it because they're saying, you're a bigot or you're racist or sexist.
Yeah. First of all, I like Dr. Gate. I think he's asking the correct questions. He's taking an analytical approach to it and is offering some thoughtful points. What I think is happening is we're trying to define cancel culture, and he's still kind of describing it. And his view of it as pressure or moral outrage is too broad of a genus for the definition. I don't think it's social. I don't think the category is social pressure. The category is in the name itself. It's culture. It's a type of culture. It's a social practice for handling disputes. And it's like a ritualized disassociation. And they ritually disassociate instead of using other means of resolution for disputes, such as arbitration or legal punishment.
Yeah, I think that that is a good insight about it being about the culture, and it being a cultural phenomenon of what their culture is trying to do. They're trying to get rid of anyone that doesn't agree with them. And going back to the last on-card clip, I mean, he eventually decides that cancel culture doesn't even need to be a term.
I resist all new terms unless I really find, oh yeah, I need cancel culture. I couldn't describe this and I couldn't conceptualize it without this new term, then I'll use the new term. But if I can just conceptualize the phenomenon, which in this case I think you can, you don't conceptualize them all in the same way, but you can conceptualize and think about it. You don't need the term cancel culture, and it's much better to have what's on the rise is a religious tribal mentality, and you see it everywhere. And one of the consequences will be that people become more and more obsessed with various forms of heresy.
He calls it a religious tribal mentality. So now, instead of it being a tactic of social pressure, it's a mentality. And I think that's wrong. I think that cancel culture is a type of social tradition now. It's come out of the social tradition of shout outs and call outs online, and now it's become a cultural norm for many people in society. And we might not need the term cancel culture, but I don't think it's an invalid concept. I think it's another name for something like a culture of disassociation or culture of ostracism, culture of nihilism at its root. It's just destroying people that they don't want in society.
But yeah, to me, he's acknowledging that there's something going on, but he doesn't want a term for it. I mean, it just, people are looking for kind of answers for it today. I mean, their episode is called Challenging Cancel Culture, but he seems to be saying he's challenging the need for the term cancel culture. I will say, and I do give him credit for identifying the rise of a religious tribal mentality, which implies it's on the left as well. And this is where I go back to my momentum theory that the tribe on the rise, the group, is the dogma on the rise is more dangerous a newer dogma hasn't had to compromise with reality as much just to continue existing. And, good for him for identifying heresy. Speaking of heretics, some of the more useful comments on cancel culture have come from the Atlas Society side. Some at ARI see Atlas Society as heretics, though I think the current euphemism they use is subjectivists. Hicks makes a very strong point to me in tying cancel culture back to postmodernism.
We've spoken a lot about postmodernism. I've written a lot on that. I don't want to blame everything on postmodernism, but postmodernism does amount to a subversion of every single liberal civilizational norm possible. And we're now into second or third generation postmodernism in higher education, depending on how you count that. So one way of thinking about this is we have had a long run of liberal education being the ethos in Western civilization and increasingly global civilization, but liberal education has been subverted rather successfully over the course of the last 2 generations. And as liberal education becomes subverted, liberal education is a microcosm for how people live the rest of their lives. It spills out into the rest of culture. So all liberal institutions properly conceived then become subject to attack. So one way to think about this just is cancel culture extended.
What's been happening in the universities is coming to the culture. I mean, why should we have expected that not to happen? I just think him saying, a subversion of every civilizational norm possible. That's the kind of language we need to be using back to these people, a more significant identification of the fundamentals at play.
I like how Hicks frames the issue as a subversion of cultural norms or civilizational norms. He's seeing it as a cultural battle, and it's one culture being replaced by another. And I think that's the attitude to that's the proper attitude to see cancel culture. It's the word culture is in the name, and I think we should begin an etymological investigation of this term by starting with the words that are in the term. And cancel culture is a social custom, a social tradition now of canceling people, treating them like TV shows. It's completely inhuman. It's postmodernism is at the root, and I think Hicks is correct in he says, he jokes that he doesn't want to blame everything on postmodernism, but the truth is the truth. You got to call a spade a spade. Postmodernism has devastated the ideas of Western Enlightenment. It's completely anti-objective truth, and cancel culture is an embodiment of that ideal, of that cultural view, and it's become a practice. It's become an institution, and they're trying to turn it into the government of the land.
Yeah, I mean, he's still trying to be objective by saying, I don't want to blame everything. It's like, it's all right, blame everything. David Kelly, for his part, he made a good point from John Stuart Mill, and how even after witch burning goes away, like with Christianity, there was still a residual social stigma in the 19th century for those not following the dominant morality.
The goal, quite apart from or independently of government action, censorship, I think is to create, and very clearly is to create a kind of stigma surrounding certain ideas. John Stuart Mill, in his wonderful book on liberty, wrote about this in talking about the freedom of opinion and speech. When he pointed out, and this is the middle of the 19th century, he was pointing out, well, we don't burn religious heretics at the stake anymore. Okay, they're safe from that. But there is a stigma that leads people, as he put it, the the most inquiring intellects find it in their advisable to keep their opinions to themselves rather than risking public opprobrium.
And why I asked, why does the stigma stick? And I think it's because in today's culture, cancel culture side, they create the norm of forming hasty conclusions based on emotions and faith and anti-concepts, and and the stigma sticks because you can't convince anybody that they are wrong, because you're using evidence and reason and logic, and they don't care about that. So postmodernism has destroyed, the value or the sense of valuing reason and logic and science and evidence and facts and objective orientation on reality. That's been wiped out. And so, people have no means of communicating the truth to the other side.
The other side seems to be fine with that. For me, what I saw out of the David Kelly clip was that as we move to a more classically liberal society where religion had lost the power to kill heretics, it still had cultural power to guilt and shame and even to influence behavior. And I think, going back to Ben Baer and even Onkar earlier, they make a related point on how the momentum of society now moving in a new direction. I think he's identifying that as we're moving away from that liberal society we were in for the last 100 or so years to the new woke dogma, that cancel culture is a first step back up, like that Christian, way in the 19th century of just making people feel bad or societally unable to speak their mind. And this cancel culture is a first step to even more identifiable censorship or heresy, as Onkar was saying. Let's listen to Baer.
The psychology that we've just been talking about, the kind of conformist psychology that fuels the argument from intimidation, is, I think, nonetheless the psychology that eventually does lead to censorship. So if you want to talk about a culture of free speech as opposed to a culture of censorship, if you're the kind of person who's so afraid of disagreement that you just want to intimidate other people into blind agreement, I mean, once people like that get political power, they do actually engage in censorship. And I think you see some of that in politicians on both sides of the aisle today. So this is why I think, even though this cancel culture phrase is poorly defined and packages together a lot of different things, the people who are worried about it, they do, I think, have their finger on something. There's a real problem out there in our intellectual culture, and we need to think much more carefully about how we engage in arguments with certain people if we want to try to fight against this.
What I like about that is Baer is recognizing that it's about the cultural practice. He's seeing it as a real problem. He's seeing that it's about blind agreement. It's about a psychology of conformity. And that's a really good observation. And I think it will lead him to the full idea of what cancel culture is. And it may already have done that. I don't know. I haven't heard his more recent views, but I think it will logically be proven that cancel culture is about not just blind agreement, but blind disassociation. It's in the name, cancel. It's about blindly canceling people. It's about not even thinking of them as humans. They are TV shows. They are books, deals. They are social platform accounts.
Right.
It's just treating them like commodities, like a gold coin that you can just give away.
And that's the history of the left. They stopped seeing bourgeois as humans. They were these things that were just holding back the revolution.
Yeah, and they're thinking of people as just interchangeable cogs of the machine. You know, it really goes down to the philosophy of collectivism. Just people are this mass group of humans who are forming this Borg ship out in space, and we're just all doing our little part for the greater good. You know, it's really is the psychology of conforming. But why are you conforming? You're conforming because you're a collectivist. And to whom are you conforming? You're conforming to the collective. So it's all about collectivism. It's about destroying individuality. It's about destroying um, objective resolutions to disagreements. It's about destroying objective laws, objective justice. It's all about just conforming to the will of the masses.
I agree. I agree. Now, Yaron, for his part, he's the Yaron Brook, the chairman of ARI, has made several comments on cancel culture in the last few months as well. I want to start with his December debate with Toby Young.
So they're outrage mobs. I mean, I don't like it. I don't think it's the right way in a civilized society we should engage in debate. But to a large extent, the outrage mobs, the people facing the outrage mobs, should grow a spine. I mean, that's part of life. Part of life is if you're out there, you're gonna outrage people. I outrage people all the time. And now, if they're calling to have me fired, then my bosses should have a spine, right?
Well, the first thing I notice about that is it's before he realized that he didn't understand what he was talking about. So
Right. He changed, he decided he hadn't been defining it. We've got that clip we'll play in just a moment.
And so back then, when he had that view, I think the mistake he was making, or one of them, was that he didn't see the connection between cancel culture and like a tradition of disassociation and all of that stuff. He saw the outrage mob as like not the right way to debate. Like he thought that he seems to think that it was about debating. It was cancel culture was some sort of debate, or they were interested in debating. But really, cancel culturalists, they don't want to debate you. They just want you to end you.
That's right. They don't want to debate at the very least. If they can cancel you, they will. I mean, there's a certain sense in that, what he said is true about people growing a spine, but on a deeper level, I go back to the fact that people are looking for answers in the face of cancel culture. People want moral bravery, and I happen to think they're right to. I mean, Jordan Peterson basically got famous for calmly standing his ground on forced pronouns. I'm convinced that even to the extent fascism grew out of socialism, it's also true that the rise of the fascists came as a reaction to unchecked socialism for so long. There were attempted communist revolutions in Italy and Germany after World War I, and they had their own version of cancel culture, calling anyone they didn't like as bourgeois, harassing them, saying they would be killed just like the Tsar.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people who are victims of cancel culture, they do have a spine and they do speak up. So it's a little petty to make that accusation that people should have a spine when they're facing the mob of cancel culture. And I question the focus that Dr. Brook had at that time. I think it was in the wrong direction. He was focusing on beating up the victim instead of beating up the bully. He wasn't trying to help the situation. He was trying to just pour fire on the victim and saying, you're spineless, you're a coward. When I think that's, first of all, it's very presumptive on his part that people who don't stand up to cancel culture don't have a spine or don't have courage. There may be a lot of different things going on in their life where they can't stand up to the mob because the mob will destroy them and they won't have a life. So if they stood up to the mob, their life would be over. And I think that's one aspect of this whole problem that he was overlooking.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, within the idea of people growing a spine, Yaron was asked later about the idea of more focus on becoming defenders against cancel culture.
How about doing more in the culture, like becoming a moral beacon against cancel culture, like more loudly standing up for those unfairly maligned? Yeah, that's great. You know, you know, but why is everybody suggesting what I should do? Go do it. Right? Go do it. I'm doing what I want to do. Um, and I'm not interested in just in spending my time seeking out those that are maligned by cancel culture. And I think it's much more complicated um, than one thinks, because a lot of people being canceled are people that I don't want to defend. I might not think they should be canceled, but I don't want to have to deal with them as a positive value as somebody I defend. But somebody else could take that up. Somebody else who doesn't mind that. I mean, there's a lot of things one can become in the culture. There's a lot of things one can do in the culture to promote better ideas. Go do it. As I said, I'm doing what I love doing and what I want to be doing.
I wonder, why would he have to deal with the victims? He says he doesn't want to have to deal with people who are maligned by cancel culture, but that's his choice. He doesn't have to deal with them. He can talk about them and defend them on his show and say they shouldn't be treated this way and cancel culture is evil. And, he could stand up for the people who are being canceled. But he doesn't have to invite them onto his show. I mean, it's his show. He's in control of it. So
Right.
it doesn't seem like a very good argument against talking about it or defending these people. I mean, you could defend a lot of people and not have to meet them in real life.
Yeah, or you're not having to vouch for their moral perfection in every other area. It doesn't even have to just about, these people, there's bad things happening to them and it shouldn't be happening. I mean, we've seen Jordan Peterson do that. We've seen people like James Lindsay do that. And, that's how we get some of these pushbacks, where we're starting to see people, these school boards, pushing back against critical race theory. But in this next clip, Yaron is very strong on the issue when asked about people hesitant about standing up to cancel culture for fear of being called a white supremacist.
Many would-be intellectuals will stay out of public discourse due to the risk of being smeared as white supremacists for not walking in the left lockstep. Well, then I'd say they're cowards. They're cowards. Fate of civilization is on the line, and they're worried about being called a white supremacist. Coward. There are always battles. There are always fights to be had. And there's some people who step forward and engage in the fight, and some people who don't. And the people who don't, and who are capable of fighting, but who don't fight and realize what the stakes are cowards for not doing it.
He's very quick to label them cowards. I mean, it goes back to the first point we made, is that it's the wrong focus. It's he's not even asking why are they afraid. He's excellent at ascribing psychological traits to people he doesn't even know. So it's like these nameless people out there that someone mentioned in a question, and he's saying they're cowards. But in order to know if someone's a coward, you have to know what their motivations are, what their problems are in real life. They have to be a real person to you, and you have to investigate their situation and their context.
I mean, there's already a lot of self-censoring that goes on in the liberty movement. People that, using civilization instead of Western civilization, just minor things that we do. And, when you're worried about that, it's not like you're worried about Jerry Falwell coming after you. You're worried about someone calling you a bigot.
And it's not just that, it's a crowd of people. It's a mob online calling you these names. And that is going to smear your reputation, and you should fear that. And if you can't deal with it, if Facebook or Twitter is not coming to your defense and preventing these people from doing this, then what resort do you have? You can't do anything about it. And if you stand up for yourself, then you'll get canceled. Facebook will say, oh, you're hate speeching these people, or you're the one, you're the problem, you're causing the problem in the community online. So there's all these questions you have to ask before you call someone a coward. They may value their Facebook account more than standing up to this mob, because the only way they're going to get any voice out there is if they maintain their Facebook account. But then there are also people who don't care about the Facebook account, so they have other means of communicating to people they want to communicate to. So it's not a real value above standing up to the crowd.
Right, that's true. Now, in being fair to Yaron, in late February of this year, he admitted that he had actually been using the term cancel culture wrong.
But I do want to start with admitting that I was probably wrong on Saturday. So it's been pointed out to me that I am wrong about cancel culture. And then maybe some of you on the chat were actually right about it, and that I was wrong about it. So, you don't see many people willing to admit that they're wrong, but on this show, we do this periodically.
He says things just off the cuff that are completely not true. Like, you don't see many people admitting they're wrong. You see that all the time. It's, I don't know where he gets this stuff. It's people admit they're wrong all the time.
Maybe he meant objectivists.
A fact of life. I don't know. It's that sort of just a random statement that I just don't understand. It's just so dogmatic. It's just like, you, and it's also you. He's talking about you. It's like in the general you, like everybody, nobody sees other people admitting they're wrong. It's just a weird phrase.
You're right. It is fair. Now, he does continue.
The point being made on the chat, and the point made to me outside of the chat, is that cancel culture assumes that people have power over you. That is, it assumes people have power to have a dramatic impact on your life. So when I throw somebody out of my house because they're a Nazi or communist, in a sense, I'm canceling them, but not really. If I got them fired from their job because I didn't like their politics or I didn't like their philosophy, that would be more like it. If I had cultural influence where the people I was opposed to were being kicked out, then I would be canceling them. So I probably misused cancel. I think somebody said you're shunning them. I'm not, I mean, I still like the word cancel, but I get what you're saying.
So there he calls it cultural influence. So if you have influence over the culture, then you've got power, and that's what cancel culture is.
Yeah. I was fascinated by the focus that him saying you have to have cultural power to cancel, which I'm not even necessarily saying I think is wrong, but it definitely reminded me of how the left uses a different version of that argument to argue for double standards. They say because Blacks, women, gays, transgenders, don't hold traditional power structures, the narrative goes, they can't be racist, sexist, etc. From the context, it sounds like maybe he said something like, he liked canceling people, at least by his old definition. And listeners, to their credit, were trying to steer him back from what could be perceived as a callous attitude towards liberty lovers feeling the pressure to self-censor.
Yeah, you're talking about how minorities don't have power, and that's part of the cultural influence and situation that Dr. Brook was talking about. So you have to ask, so the next logical question is, why do you have cultural influence? Like, if he has the power to cancel somebody, why does he have that power? And I think in his view, it's because you can fire that person or convince someone to fire them. And that's part of it. But I think he's still kind of struggling with understanding the basic mechanics of cancel culture and the power dynamics. It hasn't gotten to the point where it's like a mob issue. Like it's the collective using the power of the masses over you.
Yeah, and he's also not seeing the way that, leftist intellectuals have taken over some of these institutions and are, as a matter of policy, basing things not so much on merit but on wokeness, and at the same time they're focused less on profits and more on stakeholders.
Yeah, stakeholders is, I guess, a synonym now for the collective.
You're right. And Brooke was actually debating John Mackey about it. He was saying, no, forget stakeholders. It's got to be about profit. But, it's got to be for individuals being able to stand up and not have these fear of recriminations that even a guy like Mackey feels the pressure of.
One more point I wanted to make about that last clip is that even though he's changing his mind a little, it doesn't sound like he was listening to the ARI scholars, even from July 2020, when they were talking about that Harper's Magazine letter on justice and open debate. Because back then, Ben Baer and Onkar, they were talking about this issue, and they were making some very good points and trying to describe cancel culture and treating it as a real problem and whether or not it's a valid concept. They were coming up with these questions and ideas, and one wonders what Dr. Brook was doing. I mean, you would assume that if he was interested in objectivism, he would be listening to his own new intellectuals.
Well, yeah, now to be fair, he often says he's not involved in the day-to-day operations, but he probably would have been well served to have listened to what they had to say.
I think he should listen less to NPR programming and more to objectivist podcasters.
Well, then in this next clip, he's responding to chatter about cancel culture being an argument for the right over the left. And he boldly asserts that cancel culture could only be addressed after a Trump loss.
I think the only chance we have at defeating cancel culture, at looking at this, at changing the culture, at actually creating an opposition to Biden and cancel culture, was to defeat Donald Trump. That as long as Donald Trump was in power, there was no way to fight against cancel culture, because he symbolized the fight and discredited it completely, because he has the same mentality as they do, among many things. And I'm not going to get here into why I think Trump is as bad and as evil as he is.
So he says Trump discredited the fight against cancel culture. I'm not sure that's true. I haven't given a whole lot of thought. But I think that Trump was trying to fight it. I think he was actually making an attempt.
Absolutely.
Whereas Dr. Brook was ignoring it. So I don't know if it's fair for him, on Monday morning to criticize what Trump was doing.
Yeah, I don't think that's a fair charge at all. And I'll put forth Trump's own words last year as evidence that we could have fought it even with him in office.
We must reclaim our independence from the left's repressive mandates. Americans are exhausted trying to keep up with the latest lists of approved words and phrases and the ever more restrictive political decrees. Many things have a different name now, and the rules are constantly changing. The goal of cancel culture is to make decent Americans live in fear of being fired, expelled, shamed, humiliated, and driven from society as we know it. The far left wants to coerce you into saying what you know to be false and scare you out of saying what you know to be true. It's very sad. But on November 3rd, you can send them a very thundering message they will never forget.
So when Dr. Brook was criticizing Trump, he said that Trump discredited the fight against cancel culture. But in that clip from Trump, we heard him describe it pretty accurately, in my opinion. I mean, cancel culture is about making you live in fear of being driven from society, of being fired, being treated like you're a nobody. It's about coercing people into believing things you know not to be true. He's gotten at the root of the psychology that Mr. Baer was talking about.
I agree. In fact, that speech was probably around the same time as Baer's comments as well. Summer of last year.
Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling that, or a suspicion that Mr. Baer did his research and, read a lot of articles and watched some videos about it, because he was making some very good points that I think a lot of objectivists should have been listening to.
Sure. Now, in fairness, I want to say that, after that, Yaron at least now seems to be getting the threat. Here's another clip from an episode in March.
And then we'll just do some woke culture stuff. I mean, there's just like a avalanche. It doesn't stop. It's every day now. There's something, yeah. I mean, I'm curious to see when this kind of implodes. When it kind of people get so sick and tired of it that they turn against each other, and the whole woke thing kind of implodes.
I have a few comments about that one. Is that what authoritarian mob systems do now, is they implode? I don't think that's right. I think authoritarian systems rob, rape, murder, coerce. They do everything that Hitler did. They do everything that Stalin did. We're facing the wrath of a mob, of a collective.
Yes, we cannot just wait and watch for it to implode. People are already self-censoring as a result, accepting premises that would have been crazy 10 years ago.
Yeah, this whole affair reminds me of that Monty Python sketch in the Holy Grail, where the guards of the castle are watching the knight run up to the castle, and it cuts from the guards to the knight with his sword or whatever, running at the castle. And for every cut, for the first like 5 or 6 cuts, he's in the same spot. It's the same scene of him running in the same spot, and he's never getting closer. And the guards are just relaxed, and they're just watching this happen. And then the next cut is him right on them, cutting their throats. So it's like, it's a hilarious sketch, which concretizes the idea of not paying attention to reality, or not being serious about what you're seeing, and not recognizing the consequences of actions. Like, the knight's running towards them. Obviously, he's going to get there at some point, right? It's like the mob is there. They are doing things that are bad. Eventually, they're going to get to you.
Yeah, it's actually I vaguely remember that. That's a good clip to refresh our memories. Now, later in the show, in that same show, I guess Yaron's, just trying to show he has a good attitude about it, and not acting too upset about being canceled. But here's that clip.
I'm on the cancel list. I'm waiting to be canceled. I think it would be great publicity if I get canceled. nobody's canceled me. I'm really not happy about it.
First of all, he says that nobody has canceled him, but I seem to recall when he was doing the event with Sargon in at King's College, London, Antifa stormed into the event and essentially canceled him. So I don't know what he's talking about. He's been canceled.
Well, the only thing I'd say, he actually uses that as an example of him bravely, stoically standing up to cancel culture. I think in the video, he just kind of stands there for a minute until they clear the room, and then, you know, he just starts speaking again.
Yeah, but the fire alarm, you know, goes off, and they had to cancel and move to some other venue. So
Right.
they weren't allowed to continue the event at that venue. That's basically canceling.
Yeah, he just it's become an example of you know, how he stood bravely in the face of it.
Yeah, I mean, he got their flag, but you know, it was some other person in the audience who beat up Antifa. He wasn't throwing fists.
Well, he would say he gave them the intellectual underpinnings to do so, perhaps.
I wouldn't expect him to fight back, but you know, when nobody's there to protect you, the administrators couldn't do much. You know, if Antifa had weapons, they brought weapons there, they started, you know, really fighting, you know, what would they have done? I mean, I guess everyone there would have been a melee, would have been a
Yeah.
big brawl in there. And
I mean, just
luckily they had someone in the audience who could fight and took down one of these Antifa guys and took his flag. And that, I think that demoralized Antifa and they didn't know what to do.
yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes just one guy standing up is enough. The you know, just back to what he said, I mean, on one level, I get his, you know, we never had to take it seriously sense of life, just mocking them. And I think that mocking them is part of winning. And, you know, I'm not the ninny type, but at the same time, I mean, either cancel culture is a big deal or it's not.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a big deal, in my opinion. But Yaron doesn't seem to think it's a big deal. He says that he wants to be canceled. And I wonder, does he really want YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to cancel his accounts? That's absurd. I mean, why would he want that? So I don't think he actually wants that. I think he's just, you know, saying things. If he really does want to be canceled, maybe we should start a cancel Yaron campaign.
Well, you know, it's funny you say that. I was just watching King of Kings, the Jesus biblical movie from the 60s, and they painted a pretty sympathetic picture of Judas as someone who really only betrayed Jesus because he was desperate to save the Jewish warriors from Roman invasion. And he became convinced that, well, if he betrayed Jesus, then that would convince Jesus to call down his hosts and all of his magic powers from God. And so maybe in the same way, I mean, now that he's asking to be canceled, I mean, if we really want to, you know, play the tease and have fun and go along with it, yeah, maybe that would be the way to finally get the liberty movement to get angry about cancel culture.
Yeah.
I'm, you know, I'm
We could become Judas.
well, that's, you know, we're already considered the Judas of objectivism.
I'm gonna change my name to Judas.
Now, this last clip in April, someone asks if cancel culture is comparable to newspeak in George Orwell's 1984.
Cancel culture only works to the extent that people sanction it. Cancel culture can easily be fought if people are willing to stand up to the idiots who engage in it.
This is a real problem because he's thinking of it purely as an isolated sort of tactic that you can just brush off if you stand up to it. But it's really rooted in collectivism. It's rooted in an ideology that's not going to go away easily.
Yeah. I think he was being way flippant and saying cancel culture is so easy to fix. If that's the case, then please do it. Because, going back to my idea that the rise of fascism was a reaction to unchecked socialism, a corollary of that is that whoever offers the effective fight against cancel culture, whether they're good or evil, they will be the ones to wrest cultural power from the nihilistic left. To me, going on offense means calling out their motives for one thing. Identify that they use these tactics to avoid debate. Tell them that Ayn Rand predicted that they were going to be like this via the argument from intimidation. Say you expect them to unthinkingly call you a bigot because you're for capitalism. And hold them to a single standard before playing their game of who you have to declare evil before they'll accept you. You tell them their attitude is leading towards civil strife and that almost no one on the left has the guts to stand up to it. And further, don't self-censor into accepting the libertarian moral equivalence bromide that both sides must always be equally bad as a sneaky way of hiding from the worst side. Momentum, the dogma on the rise is more dangerous than the one in decline, and the ones you're self-censoring for are the ones that are the bad guys.
Yeah, I think you need to go on the offensive and first identify the enemy. That's crucial. And if you don't know who the enemy is and you can't convince other people who the enemy is, then you're not going to have a war. You're not going to have a battle. You're not going to solve anything. You're not going to get rid of what's evil. So you're on the right track. I think that we need to focus on what this phenomenon is, who these people are, why they're like this. And instead of going after the victim or actually seeking victimhood by wanting to be canceled, go take the fight to them, fight fire with fire, and I personally believe we need some sort of socialism control act, like we had a communism control act before. I think it's time to get super serious about this. What we're facing is really a kind of like super commie. They've realized that in order to replace an integration culture, they need to create a misintegration culture that's appealing. So they're trying to create a culture that they can use against ours. And we need to fight them on this and show how evil their culture is. It might be too late to do this at a national level, like create this like socialism control act, but I think we can implement the idea, which is basically like banning socialist advocacy from public spaces and the government. We can implement this at a state and local level where we have a lot of right-thinking people, capitalists, and some religious conservatives who agree with us on capitalist principles. We can do it at the lower levels of society, and we don't have to try to take it to the national level. If we just start at a grassroots level, that might be enough to just send a message, and the message will get out.
That's novel. We'll have to see if the courts are too far gone to let anything like that stand in the first place. It's along the lines of something I've said, that if, you can't incite violence, then advocating for socialism is kind of inciting for theft.
Exactly. That's my view of it. It's not just theft, though. It's inciting the violation of property rights. Property rights is a fundamental idea, individual rights, and socialism goes against that. That's a threat. And this would get into another subject entirely, but I believe that socialist advocacy is actually an objective threat to rights.
I think that's a fair point. We might have to do a show on that eventually. I wanted just have a little more here. There's a quote from a Just the News article from last year. For John, a libertarian from the suburbs of Oklahoma City, the conclusion by the researchers comports with his thinking. He tells Just the News that his coworkers, church friends, and even his siblings don't know about his support for the president. quote, "It's just not worth dealing with because you do have a target on your back," he says. What I got out of that was that it's counterintuitive that a libertarian who is openly afraid of being targeted by the left, even his family, yet he's much braver than those who distort reality so they can believe in the mantra that both sides are equally bad, but then in practice getting much more worked up over the Republican infractions on liberty. You know, the problem's made worse because they don't have the opportunity to stand up to the left, so they're repressing it, and then they're like, tariffs is the worst thing in the world. You know, the left, they're just like, they're socialists. It's just a generalized, they're socialists without saying anything else that can get them in trouble with the PC mob. I mean, if there's an angry mob saying defund the police, and you start writing essays or doing podcasts about police reform or talking about America being born in sin, I mean, you may have been groomed by the mob. You may be self-censoring. A stronger objectivism should strive to defend against such charges and to go on offense, to even offer education or training to counter such tactics. I think part of the reason Rand's book sales are down is that cancel culture has many people afraid to openly admit being influenced by her, even putting their bumper sticker of "Who is John Galt" on their car. Too many objectivists aren't prepared for this level of engagement against the left yet. I mean, many have fallen into the protection racket of cancel culture. They even find others on the right to call bigots, I guess, as a way to try to hold the left back. You know, and they're evading that the left already thinks Rand and them are bigots anyway, and no amount of throwing other people under the bus is going to stop it. Maybe some sort of libertarian / conservative buyers club would help, or some sort of, like you said, counter cancel culture. There has to be some consequence for those who parrot the mob so that it isn't the default position for safety. But again, I say that whoever comes up with the best solution for cancel culture, for good or bad, is going to ultimately take cultural power in the future.
I still think that the proper response is to create your own new intellectuals, which Ayn Rand argued for, and to send them out into the culture to make arguments and spread the correct ideas. The problem is we haven't been training the new intellectuals or ourselves as objectivists to respond in like kind with the left. Dr. Brook said something about we need our own outrage mobs. And I think to a certain extent that's true, but I wouldn't call them mobs. You know, they're more like warriors, like an army. They're soldiers, intellectual soldiers going out and doing combat, and we need to train objectivists to form these armies to go out and do combat with the mob. That's really the only way that it's going to work, because the left has already got collective power. They're already influencing the culture, you know, undermining Western civilization. We're at the stage of this fight where it's a street battle. It's a war. So if we're not willing to mass together in a organized group like an army, we're not going to win. It's just a simple thing.
I mean, you ultimately have to make some sort of common cause with the least irrational 50%, and understand that if we do nothing now, it's going to be an even less irrational, it's going to be, you know, a more irrational 50% we have to deal with in the future. So, well, I think we touched on some really good things today. I think, you know, we'll obviously this issue isn't going away, but we tried to offer some clarification from an Ayn Rand fan's perspective. And we'll be back with a third episode to offer some updates. William, any final thoughts you want to add?
I just think there's a lot to say about cancel culture. I think as I've researched it and thought about it more, I've come to see that it's an even bigger problem than Mr. Bayer probably thought it was, last year. I think it's the term cancel culture is identifying a major threat. It's not just the ideology anymore of collectivism or a culture of conformity. It's not just the idea, it's the practice. Now they are coming up with practices and norms and traditions that are embodying the ideology. And we're basically we're seeing the formation of a culture of collectivism, a culture of nihilism, a culture of misintegrated concepts, of anti-concepts. It's just of treating people like cogs in the machine. It's this cultural practice now, and that's what we're seeing forming around us. And I think if we don't start thinking of it or framing the fight in terms of cultural warfare, if we don't start seeing it that way, and which is how Ayn Rand thought of it. So we need to get back to the way Ayn Rand thought of it. It's
Absolutely.
this cultural battle. Like before she wrote her obituary on conservatism, she kind of sided with the conservatives. She thought conservatism meant capitalism. It was preserving capitalism, was preserving the founding ideals of America. And then she got, bummed out by what happened with conservatism and the religious element injecting itself. But I think that's mostly was an error. I think that she should have been pushing people for the right view of conservatism. It should have been, conservatism is a philosophy that preserves the rational ideals of the Enlightenment. And if she had started that movement in that direction, we wouldn't have abandoned the word conservatism, and we would be a faction within that movement, and people would start seeing it as a competing idea.
I agree, and we have to start doing that now. Or we're just going to be on the sidelines saying, "Oh, I don't like what the right's become even more now."
Yeah, and the reason why I think that is because if we just fight for objectivism, that's too narrow of a concept for so many people on the right to rally.
Yeah, I say that about flourishing. I think that's too broad to really get people motivated.
Yeah, and so we need an idea like the rightism or conservatism, or ideally we'd want to use capitalism, but even that is too narrow. It's like a social economic system. It's not a broad philosophical ideological concept. Now the argument against using conservatism is that it's an empty word and means nothing. Well, words are just, words, you can fill it with the meaning. And that's what I'm proposing. I'm proposing we start filling conservatism with the meaning we want it to mean. And that will help us gather everybody on the capitalist wing of society together.
Yeah, that's exactly who I was talking about, with the least irrational 50% left.
Yeah, and this whole idea that we're giving up our principles by allying with the right, it's just ridiculous. You don't have to give up your philosophy to find common ground with somebody.
Yeah.
You can.
If any prominent objectivists want to take that position, we'll be glad to have them on and debate the issue with them as well.
Yeah, you debate within your group. I mean, you join a broad group that's rallied around. It could even be you just hate the left. There's this, you just rally around this idea of the left is evil. We need to get rid of it. And then all all those people have to then debate what is the right view. What's the correct view? What are we really going to create once we get rid of
I
the
mean,
left?
I want to be for something, but I at least want, I understand that, the thing that unites us, but just saying that, we want to move in the direction of more liberty for people and keep it broad, and that, sponsor specific legislation that can be objectively shown to increase freedom.
Yeah.
So
Well,
let's
there's a lot
get,
to talk about there.
yeah, exactly. We're we could open up a whole new can of worms, but that's great stuff. I like the stuff you're saying at the end about conservatives, and we're going to be exploring these topics in further detail in future episodes.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Great, good show. This is the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. We'll see you next time.